Hello and welcome to this Photoshop video where I'd like to take a look at shading the edges of an image because it makes so much difference to that image and it takes little effort. If I were to mention a vignette, most photographers will instantly know what I'm talking about. It would be something along the lines of the image I currently have on screen. It's a creative way to present this and other images where the technique is appropriate. Portraits are sometimes presented in this way. The vignette effect is not hidden, far from it. It's a presentation effect that's meant to be seen. But I do something very similar to practically all my images in Adobe Camera Raw. But it's designed not to be seen in quite the same way as this. Now the shading is definitely there and it's doing a pretty good job, but it's hardly noticed by the viewer because it's far more subtle. Now I'm going to use Adobe Camera Raw for this demonstration, but any image editor should be capable of applying these techniques. Let's take a look. Now there's quite a number of different ways we can apply any shading to the edges and corners of an image. We can do so in Adobe Camera Raw, but we can also do much the same thing with selections in Photoshop. Here though, we can turn to a tool that I don't think gets used very much. It's in the Effects tab, but it's actually called vignetting. So taking this image here, if I move the slider a little bit to the left, there you can see the sort of shading I'm talking about. If this image appeared on screen in front of you, you'd hardly notice the shading was there. But if I hit the P key on my keyboard to reset it, you can not only see the effect of it, but I hope you'll agree it makes quite an improvement to the image, focusing our attention more on the main subject and keeping us away from any light areas around the edges and the corners. So here we've used the vignette slider in a subtle way, but we also can use it in a creative way simply by moving the slider a little more. If I move it more to the left, we can create the same sort of effect we saw on the historical picture a few moments ago. And if I move it more to the right, then I can create that nice white bleed off around the edges, which is appropriate for some images. Once we apply the vignette in this way, we do have the opportunity with these three sliders to adjust it. If I tweak the midpoint slider, you can see the effect that that's having. If I change the roundness, you can see exactly what's happening there, almost down to a circle and right out to the edges again. And the final one, which is the feather, where we can almost bring the edges completely sharp, not quite, but then extremely soft. So we've got quite a bit of variety here if we wanted to apply it. Remember, at any time with these sliders, just double click and they'll snap back to their original position, including the original vignette. Now, one of the ways I shade my images is using the graduated filter. The reason I use the graduated filter, which of course we can apply a number of different copies, is that quite often we may need to darken one side a little more than another. I think that's quite common. So with this type of image, I would complete most of my global changes to the image, but if I wanted to do any shading, then I'd turn to my graduated filter. Picking the graduated filter up from the top right of the toolbox, I'm going to begin by just darkening the bottom corner. You can see we've got a bit of a weak area around here compared to the rest. So if I click and drag, I can decide what I'm going to affect here. I'm going to suggest probably here all we need is a little bit of exposure. And as you can see, I get it solid and dark down at the bottom, but I've got a graduated effect through this filter, which I can adjust any way I wish. And it'll tail off about halfway through and of course have no effect on this edge. So I get the darkening exactly where I want it. If we look at the left side of this image, it doesn't look too bad, but the right side looks a little bit weaker, possibly because that's where the light is coming from on the left. So maybe I can click and drag here and bring on another graduated filter, but here I would suggest that it's probably a little bit too heavy. Now I can either go back to the sliders and just double click, but what I often do if there's more than one change made on the right hand side is just right click within the bounding box and reset all those changes. And another nice tap we can have here is with the V key. Just tap that V key, it hides the selection, makes it a bit easier for us to gauge the effect we're having. And as you can see there, that was very subtle, but it's just giving a slightly better balance on the right hand side to the left. At any time I can tap that V key again and I can bring the bounding box into play. Now we may want to look at doing something with the sky. Moving up to the top, click and drag on the way down. I'll just rotate that a little bit to sort of match the top of the tree there. The tree's almost silhouette. And I can bring maybe the highlights down. Maybe a little bit of shadow. Maybe I could look at blacks, even a bit of clarity. You get the idea. Now sometimes when I've done all this, I still feel that there's the potential for a little bit of vignetting around the edges and corners. So sometimes I'll even add a radial filter on top of the graduated filters, but we'll take a look at that in isolation a few moments later. For the moment, let me just go back to the main tabs at the top right of the screen by clicking there, so we can just look at the effect of the image. Now here, as you can see, I've opened up a completely different image, and maybe this skyscape will indicate how powerful the shading of the edges can be. Let's apply exactly the same here as we did with the previous image. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly. I'll try to do a little bit less talking and a little more doing so I can speed up the process, because many people think the editing of images can be a lengthy process, but it doesn't have to be once you get used to the tools you're using. So let's pick up the graduated tool. Let me put a bit of a base into this picture. You can see I'm just stretching up from the bottom. A little bit down on the highlights, a little bit down on the exposure, a little bit of blacks maybe. Now let's have a look at the top. We'll do the same down from the top, and maybe I can squeeze a little more in here. We've still got a weak top corner, so maybe I can add even another one there, but I'll back that one off just a little bit so I get a reasonable balance between the left and right side. The right side is a bit more blue than the left, so let's go to the temperature. I'll drop the temperature down a little bit, and there you can see it balances up nicely. We've got quite a weak area on the left hand side, so let me click and drag in, but this time I'll do what I did before. Right click and reset everything that's within that bounding box and tap the V key just to hide them. Now I can go to my highlights. I can bring my exposure down. I can possibly do something with the blacks, not too much. But of course now we've dealt with the base, the top and the left, showing up a little bit of weakness on the right, but no problem. Click and drag. Now I'm clicking and dragging without the bounding box. Doesn't matter. We can just touch the V key and it'll appear if we want it. Touch it again if you don't. Maybe the right hand side is a little bit on the heavy side here, so let me right click and reset. So I can just bring down those highlights and the exposure so I get a nice balance. Now, one good thing about these tools, if we start to use a graduated filter and we start to darken, let's say the top corner a little bit too heavy, I like the effect of the shading I've done here. Let me make that a little bit heavier. Supposing I wanted it something like this, but I'm getting a nice effect here, but a little bit too much here, maybe in that corner and maybe in the bottom right corner. Well, if we go back to the top section of this side of the screen and click the little eraser tool here, I can use my square bracket keys to make a brush. You can see the brush on the right hand side has a size, a feather and a flow. That flow looks a little high to me. I'll just drop it down to somewhere around 5 or 6. Okay, it's settled on 7, I'll live with that. I'm just going to brush over this area just a little bit, just to lighten that. Make my brush a little smaller and just brush over that little bit there. I could do with knocking down the flow a little bit, but we'll live with this. And a little bit at the bottom. So we've got the best of all worlds there, I'm going to suggest. But maybe if you look down at the bottom left, you could say that, well, now I've dealt with the darkness in the top corner and down the bottom right, maybe I've got a little bit on the left. So if I select my graduated filter and I touch the V key, there's the pin that's controlling the one on the left hand side. So if I click to bring that back into life, I can then click on the eraser tool and I'll over type that and take it down to about 4. And now I have the same effect down at the bottom left here. What I've done here is opened up 2 versions of this image. This is the one before I started to apply any of those graduated filters. And there we can see the result of 5 graduated filters. 1 on the bottom, 1 on the right, 1 on the left, 2 on the top. 1 more globally over the top and 1 up in the top left. And it makes a significant difference. Now with a completely different image opened up into Camera Raw, here's an image I've been working on in the last few days. Incidentally, this was shot with a Canon 100 to 500mm lens along with a ×2 converter. So if you look up just below the histogram, you can see this is a 1000mm lens handheld at 1/1250th of a second to capture the shot of this small bird. But what I've got in place here, if I go to my graduated filters, is very much the same as what you saw a few moments ago with the cloud. I've got 1 from the bottom, 1 from the left, 1 from the right, and 1 from the top. What I'm going to do is just make a few changes here. I'm going to remove all of those graduated filters and you'll see an instant change when I've done that. So there you can see by that instant change that it does make a significant difference. Now I've got my graduated filter already selected, so I'm going to click and drag up from the base. I'll right click within it and reset the changes that I'd already made and touch the V key. Because what I'm affecting here is some highlights, so I'm going to drop those down and a little bit of exposure too. And that looks okay. Now from the top I'm going to do the same. I'll click and drag, I'll touch that V key, right click, I'll clear all of these and start from scratch just to demonstrate that it's no real problem and quite quick to do. Now here we're in a situation where as we darken the top, we could impact the top of the bird. And if we do, that's when we may want to choose the eraser tool and maybe at the top right as well. But I won't do that right at this moment. I'll just back off a little bit, be a little bit more subtle perhaps. But now we can see there's a weakness on the left hand side. So we'll do the same there. Sometimes we get lucky, and as we drag on the graduated filter, the effect looks about right. It doesn't look too bad from the right hand side either, but I'm going to adjust it anyway. Right click within it to reset, and then just a little bit of a subtle change, nothing significant. So moving to the top right, let's clear those bounding boxes and we can see the effect of the graduated filters on the image. Now in my experience, 99 times out of 100, this type of shading will have a positive effect no matter what the content of our image is. Here we have a pretty standard picture of a Scottish loch. What I'm going to apply here is a radial filter to shade the edges and the corners, and we can do it in one go. Now the radial filter works very much the same as the graduated filter and also the adjustment brushes. I'm going to select it from the top right. You'll notice all of the options that we have open up on the right hand side. I can move on to the picture space and I can click and drag. As you can see by how I drag, I can have long ovals or almost circles, and I can rotate them and I can drag them out to match any work that I wish to do. What I'm going to do here though is to delete this one by touching the delete key, because there's another way to do this, particularly in an image like this where I just double click the center of the screen. And there you can see what Photoshop does. I'm going to touch that V key again to hide that bounding box, and all I'm going to do here is to bring down the exposure. Now we need to come down as far as we can but without it being obvious, but we can come quite a way. And all I really need to do here, I think, is to touch that P key to give you a before and after. So there, if this image was opened up on screen in front of you, you would view the image and hopefully appreciate it. But look at the difference that simple and quick shading can do. It really has a much bigger impact on the picture given the time and energy it takes. And of course we can intermix both radial filters and gradual filters. So if we look at this image and we think the right hand side is a little weak despite the radial filter, we can still add a graduated filter there. Here I have a completely different image opened up into Camera Raw. We could use graduated filters here, but let's try that radial filter. So I'm going to select it from the toolbox, and here I will click and drag. I'll rotate it and try to get it more or less over the body of the animal. You can see how versatile it is. And of course the other great thing about these bounding boxes is we can change them after we've made any of the edits over on the right hand side. So once again I'll touch the V key to hide it. I always find it's beneficial to do that because it helps me to evaluate what I'm going to do. We've got quite a bit of highlight in the background, so maybe I'll drop that down a little bit and then I'll take the exposure down. Now here we are impacting a little bit on the bird's head, and I'll deliberately go a little bit further than maybe I would normally. But all I'm going to do here is hit the P key, and you can see the difference. And as I do so, you can see the impact right on the top of the bird's head. But it's a great way to decide if we want to reach for that eraser tool and if we want to do something to relieve that a bit on the top of the head. But of course, I can bring back my bounding box, and I'll just click to liven it up, because I could decide to work another way by just eking it a little bit one way or the other to get the effect that I'm looking for. So there's the before and there's the after. Now I have applied that last radial filter a little bit on the heavy side so you can see it clearly, and I would probably back off a little bit, but that's another great thing about these tools, that if we go back into them and we re-click the pin to bring it back into play, we can back off those changes and moderate them, because sometimes we do need a few moments to evaluate the image, and what we think is great 1 minute, we come back a little while later and realise it's a bit on the heavy side. Let me try that P key one more time. You see it's still having a really good effect, but it's nowhere near as heavy as before. This type of shading has a much greater impact on our images than we fully appreciate at times. Now we could go on and present many more examples where shading has a very positive effect on the image. Let's finish with this one and use the radial filter, because sometimes there's a need to apply the radial filter outside of the picture space. So let me select the radial filter and I'll just click or double click onto the image to produce it. But I'm going to touch the control key and just click and drag to the left, because there are times when I've found the need to break the edge to get the effect I'm looking for. I'll hit the V key to hide that, and we can drop down the exposure to create the vignette. Now if I bring back that bounding box, what we can do now is, while we've made the change, we can now adjust it while we've got it in place, because it could be that we need a bias one way or the other. Maybe less here and more on the left side, maybe less at the base and maybe more at the top, so we can bring it down and move it around. What I'm going to do here is stick to around about -95 there. I'm going to open this up into Photoshop and we'll compare two versions, one without the radial filter and one with. When we look at this image without the shading, it looks okay. But when we see the shading applied, which is fairly subtle here, we still notice the improvement. Remember that image editing is a series of small steps. Each step may not be significant on their own, but added together, they very often are. Shading, as I hope I've shown here, is just one of those steps. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.